RP Plus, welcome back. Dr. James Hoffman here, and we are on our fourth video on our Recovery Adaptive Principles lecture series. Again, if you haven't watched the first three, you might want to go back and watch those first, otherwise this one might not make as much sense. So let's jump right in. Quick review, here was the base hierarchy that we've been using to describe our recovery principles and the ones that we think are the most efficacious for your use. So this is the base one. We've already touched on training within the volume landmarks and passive recovery. What we're going to talk about today are the nutritional principles and the active recovery principles that we need to know. Now, let's start with nutrition. We can see the hierarchy here in this nice green pyramid, and if you're familiar with RP, it doesn't look all that different from things you've seen before. And you are absolutely correct in that assessment. So we're not going to spend a ton of time today talking about nutrition and recovery because largely the information is the same as what we have talked about before in the past. There are a couple things that are noteworthy and different, which we're going to bring up. But other than that, if you're familiar with some of the diet stuff already, you already mostly know the same song and dance. So let's just look at a couple things that are noteworthy here in our discussion on recovery. Just as before, calories are king. If your goal is to make sure that your athlete is recovering adequately from sport or from training, you have to be sure that they are getting enough raw calories. If they are losing weight, for example, and not just water weight from activity, but losing tissue weight, they are immediately going to be at a detriment for recovery. They have to be at least in a maintenance level state, preferably in a hypercaloric state, though you don't necessarily want to have them gaining weight throughout their competitive season for a variety of reasons. So what we can say is if recovery is the goal outside of massing, we want to maintain a maintenance calorie state. We should absolutely not be in a calorie deficit. That will probably be the biggest detriment in terms of nutrition that we can do to our athlete because calories are so important. We just need that raw material to put energy back into the system, one way, shape, or form. Now within that, we know those calories are going to be composed of a certain ratio of carbs, proteins, and fats. What we know is that proteins are largely dependent on the person's size and lean body mass. Carbs are based on their activity levels, and fats are just more of a calorie buffer than anything. If the goal has shifted to recovery, one thing that we can note is that carbs become the priority. And if you've watched some of our previous stuff, we've typically said protein is the priority. In this case, protein will take a back burner to carbs. Why is that? Well, one of the causes of fatigue that we can see right off the bat is just substrate depletion. And more often than not, the limiting factor to two acute bouts of exercise or two performances is substrate depletion. What does that mean? That means if I do some training today and I have to go and play rugby tomorrow, what's probably going to inhibit my ability to play rugby? Is it that my muscle tissue is damaged? Maybe, but that's not going to be fixed by tomorrow. What's going to have a really big impact tomorrow? How much glycogen and how much energy I actually expended today relative to how much I put back in for tomorrow's game. If I don't put enough back in, my performance will absolutely go down in that next game, regardless of whether or not my muscle tissue and my joints and all those things have healed sufficiently. So one problem that we see right off the bat, we have to put a huge emphasis on carbohydrates because they have such a huge acute effect on subsequent exercise performance. So what we will see in this context is bringing fats down to pretty much minimal levels, bringing protein down a little bit from what we normally do, still not going below our minimum, right? Usually we say around 0.8 to 1. We might go down as low as 0.6 grams per pound of body weight, only in really kind of dire circumstances. And then we're going to ramp up as much calories from carbohydrates as we can after we've made those two conditions. So carbohydrates become increasingly important in the context of recovery because we need to refill lost glycogen as well as set optimal cellular recovery conditions through insulin and a number of other effects. So carbs, very, very important, really big anabolic trigger for the body. So the more carbs we have, generally the more recovery that we'll see. So that's really important. We also see that timing becomes more important. If you've seen us talk about body composition, we've said, timing is noteworthy. It's something that's worth discussing, but its effect size is relatively small. It's not going to be as impactful as calories and macros. In this case, that is still true, but we see timing kind of moving up the chain, and we say, you know what? Timing actually can become more important in the context of recovery because when you eat will influence the rate and capacity for you to replenish things like glycogen. So if you do not eat carbohydrates after training, that is a suboptimal choice relative to the subsequent exercise that you do either later that day or the next day. We want to make sure our timing gets down so we can get the most protein synthesis, the most glycogen restoration that we can in the time that we have. And that can become a limiting factor to subsequent exercise performance if we're doing a poor job. After that, mostly the same. The only thing that's really noteworthy here is we say hydration's important. Everybody has heard that if you're not hydrated, bad things happen. That is absolutely true. All we need to do is be in a state of what we call euhydration, which just means sufficiently hydrated, right? There's no award for being hyper-hydrated, meaning once you are euhydrated, it's like a check mark. You're like, you're good. You don't have to really do anything else. You don't have to keep hydrating once you are sufficiently hydrated. The only thing that's noteworthy here is being dehydrated is directly bad for performance and is noteworthy for our discussion on recovery. Now, a couple things that are not in the pyramid per se, but are noteworthy from a nutritional standpoint. Alcohol. There is no nice way to say it. Alcohol directly blunts some of the recovery adaptive processes. It makes you less muscular over time and fatter, right? That's really the reality. Now, in small kind of recreational doses, the effect is so small, it's not a big deal at all. So if you want to go out and have beers after a football game or sushi wine night with your girlfriends once a week, not a big deal. Chronic over drinking, where you're drinking to the point of drunkenness multiple times per week, is where we can start to see the effects slowly accumulating and getting worse and worse. This will cause you to have poor recovery, potentially not less muscle, but become less muscular than you would be, and certainly gain weight over time. So alcohol is definitely not a good choice in the context of recovery. What's something else notable about alcohol? Well, if you've ever gone out for a bender and had trouble sleeping, you'll know that alcohol directly inhibits your ability to get quality sleep, right? Most of us who have drinking too much before know that you have really restless sleep later on. That is because, unfortunately, the effects of alcohol are transient, meaning after the alcohol has left your bloodstream, it will continue to have psychological effects while you sleep. So the key with alcohol, I would say, is to drink during the daytime while you're at work so it doesn't disrupt your sleep. That's a really good strategy. Probably not for being productive and maintaining employment, but from a recovery standpoint might be good. Don't do that. That was a joke, right? If you think I'm being serious, come on. But long story short, alcohol, the more you drink, the worse it is, right? Try to minimize alcohol consumption. Stimulants are another one that you should be aware of. Stimulants can be really useful during cutting or when you're having really bad energy, can give you a nice little boost throughout the day to feel good. Unfortunately, stimulants trigger that stress response within your body, that fight or flight response. So it can have a nasty effect of masking fatigue, so kind of giving you the false impression that you're not tired when you are, and it can start to help accumulate kind of catabolic, especially endocrine stress responses if you are consuming high amounts of caffeine multiple times per week, like throughout the day. So it's one of those things, like it has a small effect, but it could start to become increasingly negative the more you rely on stimulants in the chronic use. One other thing that's noteworthy about stimulants, take a wild guess, if you take stimulants at nighttime, it prevents you from falling asleep because you are still in that fight or flight state. So we said sleep, aside from the volume landmarks, is probably the most important thing that we need to look at. Anything that's going to inhibit your ability to get good sleep is definitely a thumbs down in terms of recovery. So we said minimize alcohol, take stimulants on a needs basis, try to avoid in the evening once, I like to say, once all your training is done, work obligations, family obligations, once your stuff that you need to do for the day is done, lay off the stimulants. You don't need to have an espresso at 8 in the evening or a Monster or even caffeinated soda. Switch to non-caffeinated drinks and then you can start caffeinating once you have stuff to do the next day. Make sense? All right, so that's really all I wanted to talk about nutrition, because most of the stuff that in this is largely the same as you've probably heard. So let's move into active recovery, one of my favorite topics to talk about. Active recovery is this really fun series of things that we can do to keep training but actually bring fatigue down while we're training. So you'll see this kind of red and pink looking pyramid. You'll see at the base of the pyramid we have deloads, and we're going to go through all these, so don't panic if I'm moving quickly through these. Deloads is basically a microcycle of light training that really helps alleviate acute and chronic fatigue. We have mesocycle and annual volume manipulations, which is a mouthful. You can kind of put in parentheses periodization. Really powerful chronic strategy, maybe not as powerful and as applicable as deloads, but still really good. And then next we can see active rest phases, which is basically basically periods of unstructured training close to maintenance volume where we return the autonomy to the athlete and say, you know what, do your own thing, come back and see me in a few weeks and we'll get back to normal training. Light sessions, probably my favorite, and I wish they were cooler and more powerful than they are, but they're just not. It's kind of like the nutrient timing of our active recovery. It's cool and it's fun to talk about and the effects are neat. Unfortunately, it's just not all that powerful, so it's not really a big priority. And then last, we can see at the top of the pyramid, which is slightly askew, we have tapering. And tapering is a very, very competition-specific sequence of events that helps maximize athlete preparedness to its highest level at a pre-planned time. Now, unfortunately, this is the lowest on our priority list because it is specific to competitions, which many people don't compete, and it's only specific to the competitions that are the most important to us throughout the year, not to like gym meets and local meets and just like impromptu competitions, right? It's only used for the ones that are the most important to us, so it makes the last on the list. Now, let's go through all of these, give a description of each one, and figure out how to use them in our training plans. Okay, so let's start with the big one. Deloads are really important, but before we get there, let's actually just go back and take a look at how does active recovery actually work? Well, one thing that's really unique about active recovery is it operates on the following principle. Fatigue drops off faster than fitness decays. Think about it. Let's try it again. Fatigue drops off faster than fitness decays. What does that mean? That means that fatigue tends to rise up really quickly when you train, right? The good news is it does tend to drop off relatively quickly. And you can start bringing down fatigue without a huge fear of deconditioning. So this is the brilliant part of active recovery. You can do a little bit of work and maintain your fitness while simultaneously bringing down a buttload of fatigue because fatigue drops off faster than fitness does. Really, really cool, right? So how does it work? Well, we use the volume landmarks, like our maintenance volumes, to ensure that we hit the minimal threshold of training that we need, so our maintenance volume. So we don't decondition, but our maintenance volume is substantially lower than what we need to actually train and get better. It's substantially lower than our minimum effective volume and certainly a lot lower than our maximum recoverable volume. So we can bring our training volumes down to abysmally low levels without deconditioning. We said volume was probably the biggest factor. If we can drop off the volume, we will drop off a substantial amount of fatigue, but we train at our maintenance volumes so we don't lose any fitness. Holy shit, we just put it all into words. That's why this works. So really, really cool. The thing with active recovery also is that because you still have to do some training, it actually activates many of the same, maybe not entirely the same, but many similar mechanisms of recovery adaptation that training itself does. So for the same reasons you get better from training, you also can continue getting better from active recovery. Why? Because you're still activating enough force, you're still increasing blood flow to those muscles, and you're still setting up the cellular conditions for positive anabolism, right? Not to the same degree as doing hard training, but kind of just enough to get that same effect. So really, really cool stuff. It's probably one of the one of the best studied or maybe most well-documented recovery methods out there. Active recovery has been shown through a number of studies to be very, very beneficial at dropping fatigue. So really, really cool stuff. A lot of people will ask, should my active recovery strategies be planned or auto-regulated, meaning used on a needs basis or an impromptu basis? And this has created kind of a weird dichotomy in the fitness community, and what I would propose to you is that it doesn't have to be either, it should be both, right? We can have pre-planned strategies, and we can also use auto-regulation to feed back and feed forward both of those strategies. So we might have a pre-planned active recovery strategy, like having a deload, but we might find that our deload was placed at the wrong spot. And we might have to auto-regulate a deload in our mesocycle to get back in the right spot, and then we can say, you know what, I messed that up. The next time, I'm going to plan ahead and say, I know where that's supposed to be, and I'm going to pre-plan it better next time. Why not both? Like Zoidberg, right? Why not Zoidberg? Same idea. You can do both. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And then the reason we have scaled our active recovery methods the way that we have is because there is a balance of applicability and effect size that we have to hit. What does that mean? That means some of the strategies in active recovery are very, very applicable, right? That means anyone can use them. Some of them are less applicable, meaning only a very small population can use them. Some of them have really large effect sizes where it really does a great job at reducing fatigue. Some of them only have small effect sizes. So what we tried to do was find the best balance of things that are universally applicable and are scaled to have their appropriate effect sizes. So let's take a look. Deloads are light microcycles of training, typically following planned overreaching periods. There we go. Man, I was trying to get it out. It was taking a while. So the deload is essentially a period of light training following the hardest portion of training throughout the mesocycle. So if you've ever seen some of our MRV stuff before, you usually will see us going from MEV all the way up to MRV, right? And that's usually followed by this deload, which is essentially 1 week or 1 microcycle of very light training, hopefully at the maintenance level volume. Why are deloads good? Well, we have a nice list of things that we can see from deloads here. Reduced perception of fatigue, recovery of exercise performance, which, by the way, when you're looking at recovery strategies, recovery of exercise performance is probably one of the most fundamental things you need to look for, right? Does this thing that I'm doing actually help me return my exercise performance to its baseline state, right? If it doesn't do that, then it might not actually have any large influence on recovery. That will come up later in a later on video. But for now, just put a mental note there. Recovery of exercise performance is something we want to look for and we want to see. So we see that here with deloads. We can see reductions in muscle and joint pain, healing of accumulated microtrauma from hard training, right? And if we're doing a good job with our nutrition, we can have replenishment of glycogen stores, restoration of both autonomic and endocrine balance, and renewed motivation and desire to train for further training. That's a pretty good list. It's hard to make a case against deloads because the list is so good, so positive, so many good things happen. What else is nice about deloads? Well, everyone can benefit from deloading. It's not athlete specific. Anyone who's training for whatever they're doing can benefit from taking a deload. So its applicability is very high. And its effect size is very high. It reduces acute and chronic fatigue to a very large extent, right? You can be pretty refreshed and pretty renewed after a whole month or whole mesocycle of training. So the effect is really, really good. So it's a really nice balance of both being applicable and having a large effect size. So how do we set up our deloads? Our deloads are performed once per mesocycle, typically after the planned overreaching period, or if you're not really sure what that is, once every 3 to 6 weeks, you should basically take a deload or a light microcycle, right? How do we set it up? Well, essentially the volume of training, so the total stuff that you do, whether it's weight training, sport training, or any combination of things, is reduced to the maintenance volume. If you don't know the maintenance volume, go back and figure it out, right? Back to that prerequisite step. See, I got you. You were thinking about it. If you don't know it, another good place to start to kind of get a ballpark idea of where it should be, take what you normally did for an overloading week, cut it in half. Literally, take 50%. So if you normally would do 6 by 10, cut it down to 3 by 10. If you normally would do 2 hours of practice, cut it down to 1 hour of practice. And then you can go through those same steps in finding your volume landmarks that we did in the previous video. But that's a good rough ball place to start. Ideally, it should be at the maintenance volume, which is much lower than most people realize. So the deload itself is going to be broken up into 2 phases. And again, this is only going to last for about a week. So the first phase is going to be probably anywhere between 1 and 4 days. And this is just simply a volume reduction. So again, bringing the volume down to maintenance volumes, or roughly half of what you did before. We're going to keep the intensity basically the same, or maybe slightly less than what you were doing before. So if you were squatting 100 kilos for your hard sets, maybe bump it down to like 95, something like that. Nothing too crazy, but just a little bit easier than what you were doing before, mostly the same. Phase 2 will be the last like 1 to 2 sessions that you do throughout that week, and that will be a volume reduction, which is what you've already done, and then an intensity reduction as well, which indirectly also reduces the volume. The intensity reduction should usually be somewhere around 60% of what you would normally do as an overloading day. So that should feel very, very light, right? It's basically like warm-up weights and very, very low sets and reps. And this is a really good way of reducing any accumulated microtrauma that you've accrued throughout the mesocycle, which is highly interrelated with the intensity of exercise. So we want to see that volume reduction for the first part, volume and intensity reduction for the second part. Once that's done, you should have that really high desire to train, that itch to get back to the gym. And if you feel that, you'll know you did a really good job. Okay. Mesocycle and annual volume manipulations, aka periodization, is a much grander scale version of a deload. Essentially, this is looking at taking periods of high volume training and then moderate volume and even low volume training throughout the year, which can be done a number of different ways. And what we see from this type of activity parallels what we see with the deloads, just on a much grander scale. So essentially you can think of it of taking a low volume training mesocycle instead of taking a low volume training week, which is the deload. Does that make sense? So you can think of it this way. If you are somebody who's training for health and or physique, the bulk of your training is probably going to be hypertrophy. We know that hypertrophy is second only to endurance training in terms of the total volume that you're going to have to do. So it's very high volume training, right? Unfortunately for you, you cannot just sustain that high volume training all the time. You will be subject to plateauing, staleness, burnout, and it just sucks and it's going to wear and tear on you for a while. So what is a good idea is periodically taking a lower volume training phase. How you do that is up to you. There's a number of different strategies. So we can look at things like taking mini cuts, resensitization phases, strength phases, all of which simply just bring the volume down to maintenance volume or just substantially lower than what you were doing before. We know that these volume manipulations have an additional role of helping restore training sensitivity, which allows you to continue making gains from that training stimulus, which you have come accustomed to, right? So once you start adapting to that training stimulus, you can hit this plateauing kind of burnout zone where you can just keep slamming it hard and hard and hard all day, and you're not making substantial progress. Why is that? Well, it's because you are making a lot of chronic adaptations to what you're doing. You need some variation in there to mix it up. So one of the things that we can do is bring the training volume down, resensitize you to that training stimulus, and when you go back to that hypertrophy training, you'll start making gains again, which is really cool. And then one other thing that it does is it helps prevent this state of burnout, which is something as coaches and athletes, we really want to prevent at all costs. Burnout is the point where basically your athlete is to the point where they're like, fuck this. If I have to jump rope or do a wall ball or do another squat or kick another soccer ball, I'm going to vomit, I'm going to lose my mind. We've all been there, right? We want to prevent this state at all cost. This is kind of a nice long-term investment in preventing that. Because once they get to that burnout point, they usually have to move into active rest, where they have to just basically go off on their own for a little while. And that's just time spent away from doing really, really productive training. And it might actually cause them to have to go through some psychological counseling to get back to where they want to be as well. So we want to prevent that as much as we can. Having some fluctuations in the training volume through different mechanisms is a really nice way of doing that. So let's go and look how we might do this. How we apply these periodization strategies really depends on what you are doing, if you are a sporting athlete or just training for health and physique. If you're training for health and physique, the volume should be reduced once every 2 to 3 mesocycles or so, right? What you don't want to do is just do more than 3 continued hypertrophy mesocycles back to back to back. You're going to start getting diminishing returns, possibly even negative returns on those. So what we recommend is every 2 to 3 mesocycles, pepper in either a resensitization phase, which is a phase where you're training at maintenance volume exclusively, a strength phase, which is training at like 2/3 of your hypertrophy volume, or you can do something like a mini cut, which is basically training at your MEV and dropping a little bit of weight along the way. Any of those things will work great, basically gets the desired effect. If you are training in a traditional sport like track and field or a team sport where you have a normal competitive type activity, essentially all we recommend is every 1 to 3 mesocycles, shift the training emphasis. If you were doing hypertrophy, move into strength. If you were doing strength, move into power. If you were doing power, move into speed, right? Something like that gets the same desired effect. What you don't want to do is spend 3 mesocycles or more doing the same thing. You're going to run into that plateauing effect, and you're also not training the other fitness characteristics you need to be successful at your sport. So luckily for us, traditional periodization and phase potentiation models for sport already cover this for us, but they just don't realize that they're using the volume landmarks to do that. So as long as you are making transitions, every 1 to 3 mesocycles are so, and just not blasting like strength for 3 mesocycles or power for 3 mesocycles and trying to just keep doing that, you're good. Mix it up, have a phase potentiated model, and have a little bit of variation in which fitness characteristics you're training over time. You can always cycle back to ones that are priorities. Like if you're saying, my athlete needs to gain a lot of weight, what might be a good idea is doing 2 hypertrophy mesocycles, a strength mesocycle, and then repeating that. Go back to hypertrophy again, rather than trying to blast out 6 mesocycles of hypertrophy. It's probably a better long-term investment for fatigue management and plateauing. Make sense? Okay, so let's move on. That was a big one. Active rest is another thing that we can use. It's unfortunately something that we have to use when the athlete is carrying around a lot of baggage, right? That can be physical and psychological baggage. Essentially, when they have gotten to the point of burnout or are teetering with that burnout point where the thought of doing their normal sport training makes them ill, they have lost their desire to participate in sport or in training in general. In fact, it might even make them sick to their stomach, right? At this point, we have to let the athlete go, and we have to say, we are going to let you do some non-structured training. That doesn't mean you're not going to train. It just means I'm not going to program the training for you. I'm putting your fate back into your hands. The autonomy is now yours, right? You get to decide. All I ask you to do are 3 basic things, which we'll get to in a second here. But before that, let's make a case for doing active rest. So again, we have an athlete. They have a little bit of baggage because they had a really grueling sports season. Maybe they were trying to make the CrossFit Games. They got to the regionals and then they just couldn't quite make it to the big show. And now they're like really upset because they put a lot of stock into it and they're just overwhelmed with the whole thing, right? So what should we expect to see if we move our athlete into active rest? Well, in terms of physical effects on the physiology, basically going to see the same effects as doing a deload. Why? Because we're having them do low volume training for a prolonged period of time. So all the physical effects that we saw in deloading, we would expect to see here. There are some unique psychological benefits that are worth mentioning, and that is increases in motivation and desire to train, increases in confidence and self-efficacy, restoration of normal sleep, and restoration of mood and affect. So in addition to all those positive things that we see from deloading, we can see some of these things occurring as well as the athlete is given some space, given some autonomy, time to do what they want. Typically, we program these in kind of like 1 to 4 week blocks where we say, you know what, do your thing. If you want to just blast some curls and shrugs in front of the dumbbell rack and get in everyone's way, that's fine. If you want to just do knee extensions instead of high bar squats, do your thing. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You do what you want. Come back and see me in 3 weeks. That's the idea here. The 3 rules that I mentioned. So when we say, I'm letting you go, all you have to do for me is 3 things. Don't lose muscle. Don't get super fat. Don't decondition. How do we do that? We use our volume landmarks. We can say, you know what? If you want to train at maintenance volumes, that's fine. That will help you not lose muscle and not decondition. All I need you to do is not go and slam pizza buffet every day. Don't get super fat. All will be good, right? So we use these phases, again, when our athlete is in a bad way, usually following really grueling stretches of training or competition, and they're going to last between 1 to 4 weeks depending on the athlete's developmental level. For people who are in health and fitness and physique, you might not do this at all. This is something that is more specific to sporting athletes, so its applicability is slightly lower, though it has a very large effect size. So the effect of taking active rest on fatigue management is very large. Unfortunately, not everyone needs to do it, right? Because most of us who are doing health and fitness training don't get to this point where we're so sick of doing all this. It really only occurs after doing really, really hard like dieting, where you're just like, oh, I can't do any more dieting, I'm sick of this. That's probably the only time where this will come up. For our more traditional sporting athletes, this might occur anywhere between 0 and 2 times per year, probably no more than 2 or 3 times at the most. Why? Essentially because you have 1 to 4 weeks of non-structured training. That's just time spent away from either gaining skills, gaining fitness, or gaining competitive experience at that point, right? So maybe not the best allocation of time, only when our athletes are in a bad way. If our athletes are in a bad way that needs active rest more than 2 times per year, you may have to consider very strongly reevaluating their volume landmarks, because you are probably chronically overtraining them and they're probably constantly on the teetering point of overreaching and just barely hanging on. That's what I would say. So very, very good strategy. Unfortunately, its applicability is low. Contrary to that, light sessions, my favorite to talk about, have very, very high applicability. Everyone can do light sessions. Doesn't matter what sport you're in, bodybuilding, rugby, training for health, table tennis, darts, whatever. Any sport, any activity can do light sessions. What's the downside? Well, the effect size is just not that powerful. So let's back up a little bit. What are light sessions? Light sessions essentially are sessions where you do the exact same stuff that you normally do. If you're a powerlifter, you squat, bench, deadlift. If you're a weightlifter, you snatch, clean and jerk, squat, all that normal stuff. If you're a rugby player, you pass and catch rugby balls, run up and down the field. Same exact stuff you normally do, done at a significantly reduced volume. How much volume do you reduce? Roughly half. So about 50% of what you normally would do for an overloading training session. So what's the deal here? Well, essentially what we're doing is taking that light training session, a very low volume training session, where we're allowing some of that fatigue to dissipate. We're putting in a little bit of effort. we're activating some of the same recovery mechanisms that regular training does without this big blast of fatigue that comes with it. And what we find is that the net effect of the light session is that it actually reduces a lot more fatigue than it generates. So the net effect is very powerful. It's not, I should rephrase that. The net effect is a reduction in fatigue, although it's not very powerful. That's the downside. So what are some expected outcomes of light sessions? Well, first thing we'll see is diminished perception of fatigue, so how they feel will be improved. They won't feel quite as tired. We'll see recovery of exercise performance and replenishment of glycogen stores if we're doing a good job with our nutrition. So one thing that we've seen that's kind of unique is that with light sessions, sometimes we find that light sessions can reduce more fatigue than doing absolute rest, meaning doing nothing. So in this case, we have to invest a little bit of energy we put into it, but in some cases, this is actually better than doing nothing at reducing fatigue. Why? Because again, it activates some of those same mechanisms like increasing blood flow, which will enhance nutrient uptake, waste product removal. It activates some of the same cellular regulators for anabolism as regular training does, just without that huge backlash of fatigue. So we can see that actually doing something in some cases is better than nothing, which is pretty cool. So how do we apply light sessions? Light sessions can be applied a number of different ways depending on which sport you're doing. You can apply it to your normal sporting activities, like if you normally had a 2-hour practice, make it a 1-hour practice. If you normally would do 8 sets of chest, do 4 sets of chest, something like that, right? We can get really creative depending on what sporting activity we're doing. If we're doing physique sports, we might actually have a more complex heavy and light split where we might train parts of our body twice per week, one of them heavy, one of them light. For example, let's say I was training my legs twice per week. I might decide to make one of those a quad emphasis day where I do a lot of sets of quads, maybe like 10 to 12 sets of quads, but I take a light session on my hamstrings or my posterior chain. Maybe only do like 2 sets of like good mornings or lying leg curls or something like that. But then when I do my second leg session throughout the week, I flip-flop it and I say, I'm going to do a really, really hard hamstring session. I'm going to do like 8 to 10 sets of hamstrings and then only maybe like 2 to 3 sets of quads. That's my light session there. See where I'm going with that? There's any number of creative combinations you can use for these light sessions, all of which are really, really good and really useful. How often should you do it? We recommend 1 to 2 times per microcycle, possibly more for our traditional sporting athletes. So if you have somebody who trains like 3 times a day, like if they're a collegiate soccer player where they have conditioning, sport practice, strength training, all that stuff, it might be more than 2 times per microcycle. Many of those sessions might be light, and that's perfectly fine. For people who are more health, fitness, physique oriented, probably 1 to 2 per microcycle, or maybe 1 to 2 per body part, depending on how frequently you're being trained, something like that. So how do we do it? The volume again should be roughly half of what they normally do, possibly less if you are familiar with the volume landmarks. And then the intensity can be maintained, though if you are working in strength power type activities, like if you have an athlete who's in a strength or power phase, you might not have that much volume to actually kind of play around with. So what you can do is reduce the volume a little bit and then reduce the relative intensity by about 15%. So if they were doing, let's say, 3x5s at 85% of 3x5, you might have them do 3x5 at 70% of 3x5. We didn't bring the sets down, but that reduction in the weight is actually enough of a volume reduction and an intensity reduction to get the desired effect. So either one of those tend to work fine. When you're working with in high intensity phases, sometimes you need to bring the relative intensity down to bring the volume down and get the effect that you want. Either way, light sessions are one of my favorites. You can get really, really creative. I have used them with massive success in my coaching career as well as my personal athletic endeavors. I'm a huge fan. Just keep in the back of your mind, know that this is only for acute fatigue and the effect is not that powerful, but you can get creative and use them very, very in a wide variety of situations. Okay, tapering is the last one on our list. Tapering is probably the most powerful active recovery strategy that we can talk about, easily the most powerful in my opinion, because it's meant to bring our athlete to the highest level of athlete preparedness that they will experience throughout the year, the highest, right? What's the downside? Well, it's probably the least applicable, meaning there's no need for somebody training for health and fitness to taper at all. There's zero need. There's actually no incentive to taper at all. And even within athletes, the people who are tapering are only tapering for their most important competitions, maybe once, twice at the most throughout the year, but probably more like once. So its applicability is very, very low. There is a enormous enormous laundry list of benefits. I'm going to give you the short version, but this does not do it justice. So what can we expect to see from tapering? Well, we can see an actual increase in performance. So with deloads and light sessions, we saw restoration of performance, meaning back to normal. This we can actually see performance going up because we're maximizing preparedness by dropping out fatigue. So we can see performance actually goes up. We can see decreases in perception of effort, fatigue, and mood disturbances, improvements in quality of sleep, and then we can see, like I said, a laundry list of numerous central and peripheral physiological adaptations that occur, all of which can lead to performance-related improvements. So tapering, I cannot understate how powerful it is, but unfortunately, most of us will never need to use it, so it's kind of not necessarily worth discussing for most of us. However, if you want to know more about tapering, I have a book here which you can see on the side of the screen. It's called Tapering and Peaking for Optimal Performance by Inigo Mujica. This is a wonderful, wonderful textbook. I'm giving you the free shout out. I didn't even get any sponsorship for this, right? Free shout out to Mujica. This is a wonderful book. It is exclusively on tapering. It is literally an entire book about the benefits and application of tapering for sport. If you want to know more about that, that's the book that I would go to. It's the book that I do go to when I design these for my athletes as well. So if you want to know more about tapering, please buy this book. It's wonderful and it will do it much more justice than I can do it in this video. Woo! That was a lot of stuff. All right. We've gotten a pretty good chunk of the way through the pyramid. We've covered training within the volume landmarks, passive recovery, nutrition, and active recovery. Next time, we'll start getting into the more nitty-gritty, the fine-tuning, and we'll cover our therapeutic and supplemental strategies. Folks, it's been a pleasure. I will see you next time.